Welcome to Loaded and Rolling. It's Thomas Wasson, trucking expert here at FreightWaves. And on today's show, going to be really awesome talking about cargo security, especially cargo theft, and what is that going to mean for the freight markets. And I was digging around this last week as well. It was Thanksgiving, the holidays, and so holidays and cargo thefts, of course, rise. But there's some really cool infographics. We'll see if we can throw them up as well about what happens. This is from Cargo Net. And then I'm looking at here, I've got a laptop. So if you're looking at the podcast, I'm having to read it. We'll throw the graphics up when we find it here. But if you want to know, to kind of preface before we get going here, the types and top commodities targeted is food and beverage, electronics, and household goods. Top three for getting stolen here. The average cargo loss value, according to CargoNet, is $163,000. 429 cents, nearly 164K. And if you're wondering where they happen, here, I'm going to throw up the graphic as well. The parking lot, your warehouse, DC, or a truck stop. So this is really cool stuff here, especially the amount of incidences. So, we're at 126, but this was on the from the provider CargoNet. And so, one thing we forget about during the holidays is that drivers are going home. A lot of times they are laden. You want to stack your driver home with freight, and we're going to throw some tips in a minute, but what can happen is it can get broken into. So one more thing, we're going to throw the second one up here. And this is the other thing I found super interesting because, my biggest one here that I wanted to highlight is securing the load. This is something that I think people forget about. I always ask about, why do we have the load locks, which are typically like a form of padlock, as well as the little plastic thing you're wrapping around it. But you're supposed to use better seals. So a kingpin lock, things to remember, as well as steering column locks. There's a bunch of stuff out there. So I typically talk about how, there's not a lot being done. But if you follow the instructions, I post this on Twitter as well, you could have a lower chance. But let's bring in the expert here because I thought the two images are really interesting to kind of bring up the topic. But we're going to be talking with Phil Schmidbauer. He is with ODW Logistics, and he is a senior director of analytics and solutions. And Phil, super excited to have you back on, get to talk to you as well again. Tell us about, what's going on in this cargo theft. How big of a deal is this? ODW's been doing warehousing since 71, so y'all are a lot more exposed than me, who's tracking my Amazon packages on a phone.
Yeah, yeah, Thomas. Appreciate having you. It was good seeing you a couple weeks ago, and thanks for having me on. Um, I don't. I think those graphics are interesting. I think it's just interesting to think about. People can get it stolen right out of the back of the trailer. I've seen entire loads attempted to be stolen and stolen in the past. And to your point, there's things you can do to mitigate it. There's some things that we're hypersensitive to. When you have a load of copper, people love to try to steal a load of copper from you. And to your point, consumer goods. And not only from the warehouse standpoint when something's getting picked up, but also to your point, when it's in transit, once it's in transit, what are you doing to making sure carriers are being diligent with those trailers? Where are they going with those trailers? That they're not just sitting in an unsecured drop lot somewhere. So it's interesting to look at those graphics and see really the incidents as they happen, because nobody really thinks about it until something happens to one of your loads. Then you're like, oh man, how did that happen? So I always believe it's more prudent to be proactive than reactive in a situation like this.
And thinking about being proactive as well, where does it generally start? Because I think this is an interesting thing. A lot of times, if a theft does occur, we do see the blame game. Sometimes the broker blames the carrier blames the shipper, and whatnot. When we're trying to root cause this and try to have best practices at the beginning, where does it typically start? At least the conversation.
Oh, that's a good question. We had one recently, Thomas, that I heard about, and I don't even know that I can specifically explain exactly how it happened, but it was basically somebody spoofed a carrier, pretended to be a carrier, actually sent in an actual carrier to go pick up a load, took it to a location to get transloaded onto another carrier. That location was just doing what they were asked to do, and then in the middle of investigating a load theft, found out that there was other loads that were being processed through that location and actually stealing an entire load, right? But then finding out who was actually doing it was darn near impossible to have done. But they found out and stopped the loading of another fraudulent loan in the middle of investigation, right? So I was talking to somebody about that load. And it's like it's really hard to even find out how these things are happening. But what it really boils down to is everybody needs to be diligent along the line. So we like to, for example, at our warehouse, we want to make sure we know exactly what carrier is picking up, what the truck name is, and making sure that driver's accountable for that. There's a lot of technologies out there that are supporting some of this. When you're seeing some of these loads that are being spoofed, I call it, or somebody pretending to be a carrier, making sure that it's actually that carrier. So, for example, our brokers, when they're booking a load, they don't book a load with a carrier unless they can tell us what the phone number is, the address, that we're using technology to set new carriers up and making sure we know who's who when we're booking loads. So it really boils down to people along the lines, whether it's a broker, whether it's a shipper, being connected and understanding who's supposed to pick up that load and who's actually there to pick it up. So there's technologies to support. And unfortunately, in the end, the owner of the goods is the one that's usually out and filing a claim. The question comes in is, who are we filing the claim against? Are we filing it against the carrier, the shipping facility, et cetera? And there's not always black and white answers to who's responsible. And that's the difficult part when you're trying to stop thieves.
And I think that's one of the big things is, the trucking and freight has been such a high trust thing. Before all the
Mm.
technology, even you had such a great point about even transloading. Like when I needed to transload, it literally was just you Google a facility, you call them, they say, "Hey, yeah, I have dock space." You send in a driver, and they're just doing it, and they say, "Okay, give me the com check or how's payment going to be done?" And I mean, that's
Yeah.
literally it's so easy to fly under the radar when you're those facilities. And just like with the sending a load in, when I was double brokered as a dispatcher, we sent the driver in, but the rate con was sent with another carrier. So we called the broker and they said, "No, no, it's okay. It's two loads. I have two loads. You're just the other one. I hadn't sent it back yet." And then the shipper found out
Yeah.
it was only one load. So it does feel like right now, I guess people are, because of how the economy, there was more money the past 2 years. It's almost like these really tech savvy people are coming in there, taking advantage of this trust that we just got used to.
Yeah, I mean, whether they're going to hijack your systems in a tech savvy environment, and hold your systems hostage, like we saw with SDs and other people. You got people doing the same thing with freight, and they're coming into networks and figuring out how this works. And I mean, they have to understand freight, right? Because of how just articulate they are with their schemes. It's ridiculous. And it's just something we got to be hyper vigilant about in the industry, and making sure that we have checks and balances in place. And you don't give a piece of freight or a shipment to somebody that isn't there. And then the other part of some of the graphic you showed, like knowing what your carriers are doing with the freight. And you're right, over the holiday, you got a bunch of drivers trying to get home. You're giving them loads, knowing that it's probably going to sit, not deliver till after that. Just making sure that they have a load lock in place, that they're putting a padlock on it. And again, nothing's perfect, right? Padlocks can be cut. If people really want to get at freight, but it's just trying to be vigilant and work together as an industry, whether it be new technology providers and really sharing best practices on some of these processes to try to eliminate theft as much as possible.
And I've got a fun one. I pulled those tips up because it's a huge graphic, tons of little tips. My favorite one I found was remind drivers to arrive at the pickup well rested, showered, and fed with a full tank of fuel. And I think that's such a crazy thing because I had spoken to or read somewhere that the sophistication now is once the thieves discover a distribution center sells a certain thing. So beverage was the top one. So let's say we have a
Yeah.
beverage distribution center. They'll purposefully try to follow some of these trucks out, and if they're not fully well rested, if they're low on hours, they take a break 5 miles from the shipper, or they're not fueled up and they need to take a shower. I guess that's what they'll do is they'll pop the back of that trailer open. And it blows my mind because you wouldn't assume that people are actually staking out these distribution centers to try to get access.
I mean, Thomas, is interesting because whenever I hear something like that, I don't think like that, right? I'm not a thief, so I don't think like, oh, how can I rip somebody off today, right? But you almost have to train yourself to start thinking about how you could get ripped off as you're going through this, right? So to your point, like you don't think about some of those things. And from a carrier perspective, I'm sure a lot of them, and I know a lot of carrier partners we have, that they'll have something happen in one part of the country, and then they're starting to think about it and sharing that best practice across other locations. So, I mean, you're right. As you see these things, unfortunately, we learn by having bad things happen to us. So as we do that, it's about sharing those things and making sure that other people can learn from our mistakes and or from something we never saw coming. So how do we get better at getting rid of this? I think it was fun a couple of weeks ago. I had a lot of conversations with people about theft, right, and what they're doing. And you learn a lot of little things that happen in the middle of those conversations. But it's just about continuing to share and make people aware.
And I think that's one interesting thing is from your conversations or being in the industry as long as you have been, do you see instances where shippers are having to change their behavior, or is this something where maybe we're just finally getting more attention brought up to it through media outlets and other stuff? I wonder if we've seen any adjustments over the few years because of this growing sophistication.
I'm not sure if you just called me old. I think you did, but that's okay. No,
Seasoned,
I
seasoned.
think it's about season. No, I think to me, it's all about learning to keep up with the thieves, right? Or trying to stay ahead of them. So, like, yeah, there's absolutely things that we're doing that we learn from that we didn't think about before that you hear about from somebody else, right? It's always good to learn from someone else's mistakes than your own. But I absolutely, in the number of years since I graduated college in 2002, so I'll date myself. But since then, every year it's something different. Like it's something else. There's a new technology out to try to help with it. As thieves get smarter and more tech savvy, and as there's more technology out there, we have to do the same thing in the industry: is adapt and understand how we're going to eliminate some of these things from happening, or learn from some of our mistakes or somebody else's mistakes. So, to your point, yes, there's things that tried and true methods that you can use, but there's always something new we got to protect against. And even from IT hacks and making sure you're not clicking on the wrong link, that all of a sudden you can give away all kinds of information about your company, and then it's worse than a load being. It's all your information and data and bank accounts and who knows what. So I think there's a little bit of both to that. Old methods and then learning from current mistakes and how we can get better and be smarter than thieves.
Well, let's talk about the market conditions as well, because I think that not only is cargo theft something that is ongoing, but depending upon the environment of freight, right
Mhm.
now it's tough for carriers to find loads, and so I wonder if that's a situation where maybe we're seeing a larger increase of that because these carriers are willing to not pay attention to who they're getting the load from, or maybe they're willing to say give it, risk it, and try it at least, even if they're getting double brokered, because otherwise it's a big goose egg for the day. They're not putting revenue on the truck.
Yeah, from a carrier perspective, I think that's an interesting take, right? Everybody's let's call it tolerance for risk is going to change based on the business climate, and you see it everywhere. So carriers are obviously going to do the same thing. Same with with brokers in a certain environment, right? So maybe brokers are a little bit less leery right now because it's a little easier to find carriers on who they're giving it to. But to your point, everybody's tolerance is going to shift based on that business environment today. So it certainly is a tough market, not the number of loads out there that carriers would love to see, and so that's certainly playing a factor, I'm sure.
I always wonder as a broker as well, and you all luckily being multimodal, having the warehouse experience, brokerage and assets, you kind of get to see it all. But one of the funny comments and one of the tips that I saw is that be wary of truckers that are willing to take a undesirable load for a lower rate than the industry standard. May set you up for a theft. And in this market condition, everyone's taking undesirable loads for a
Yeah,
lower rate than the industry standard. I wonder where you
yeah,
draw that line, because when I was a broker, you would get some rates and some rips that are too good to be true. Maybe this is $100 margin lane. This guy really wants it for 2 to 250. And when you're in this environment, sometimes you don't think, and you're like, all right, are they in the system? Yeah, MC's good. Send it. Already cleared compliance a year ago. I wonder
yeah.
about that as well, because it does feel like you're between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, you got to be real careful. And I would say making sure you're leveraging some of the relationships And if you're setting up a new carrier, it's like hyper vigilant, double checking, triple checking, making sure you know who you're talking to. Because you're right. Who's going to define what the low end of the market is when the market just keeps dropping on you? And what's a ridiculously low rate? And I mean, there's sometimes where you're like, well, I don't know if this is just a really good rate because the driver just wants fuel money to get home for Thanksgiving, or if this is somebody trying to steal the load. So it's all about going into the back end and understanding: are you positive you know who you're giving this load to? Did you double and triple check and make sure that this is the right guy, that he's got the right email address, he's got the right? Is it somebody right? So it's kind of like, I trust my neighbor that he's going to bring a package inside for me, but do you know who you're actually talking to, and verifying that? So to your point, it's very people have to be cautious because there's not really to your point, there's not really a low end on where the rates are right now. It's been ridiculous at some points.
I think that's the biggest thing that's probably underreported is both brokers and carriers in this market. You're going to take more risk because you're either trying to expand that margin or you're trying to book it on the load. But I wonder from the compliance standpoint as well. It seemed easier 2 years ago when I'm filling out carrier packets when the market was hot and we needed trucks. But now it's almost
Yeah.
like the compliance people are taking over and saying, I know there's like all these carriers, but I need to like start double checking it. Do you ever see a seesaw effect depending upon the market cycle if it's a boom or bust?
Absolutely, and it could be just with the loads we're looking at too, right? If you got a high value load, you're going to be hyper vigilant on who you're booking it for. Nothing against somebody with a lower value load, but it's not a product that people are aiming for, right? If we're shipping a load of copper, we're going to be hyper vigilant, making sure that that's the carrier showing up, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. That's what our industry is, right? That's part of the fun of it is things are never the same. They're always going to change, and next month will be different from this month. So it keeps us on our toes a little bit, but there's absolutely a seesaw that happens in the environment.
Do you think, especially with technology, before we hit the nearshoring question, because I feel like that's going to be something big to tackle as well. Do you think, from a technology standpoint, we're going to see, even from a warehousing? I know that Amazon has ways to check in. People are using QR codes or certain types of things on an app to verify. Do you see a situation where some of these smaller cap customers or small cap shippers are having to pay more attention to it, or do you think that we're still stuck in this mode where, well, I got Bob's cell phone and I know which truck it is, what's on the truck. It still feels like we're verifying stuck in like the 80s or 90s.
Yeah, I'm when it comes to technology, I firmly believe in good process, right? And then technology can oftentimes automate a process, make it more foolproof. You've got the the dual authentication and stuff like that today. That certainly could be helpful, but I do feel like if you have a good solid process, it still works. And I know I talk about this a lot with other people, but in one of my past lives, we had drivers that would verify on pencil and paper what they were picking up, making sure they checked it off and knew what they had. And if there was any discrepancies, they called into the office. That process still works today for that business unit, and it's great. So I think that technology can certainly support, but what I often find is if you don't have a good process on the back end, technology is not necessarily going to fix your problem, right? So you got to have a good solid process of verification, and then technology can oftentimes automate that for you. So I do feel like technology is going to help. I think when it comes to setting up carriers, there's technologies that are helping do that and identifying things that we wouldn't see. And without turning this into a commercial, I think there's certainly companies that are supporting the theft on the back end and saying, hey, this carrier is showing in our system they've only got 2 trucks, but the one you're booking with is saying that we've got more, and they've got way more payables out there than we have. We show loads that are possible for them to have that. So it's throwing red flags up when we see those type of things on the front end of setting up carriers.
I think that's really cool. I didn't think about the payable aspect because, when you do your MCS form 150 every year, you got to update it. But having the technology between the payables, that's really smart because I would assume that if I'm spoofing carriers and stuff, I need all my payables to go to one place, but the MC numbers, I'm
Yeah,
swapping them around.
yeah, yeah. All different types of ways to try to catch these guys out there. That's for sure.
Let's talk about nearshoring and cross border. This is one of the things that frequently everyone is talking about. We see developments in Monterey, the Tesla factory, Chinese multinationals doing developments and stuff. But one thing that I'm curious about is now we're going to see more of this cross border movement. What about the cargo security situation? Can't remember who I spoke with. Swear, it's after F3, my brain just it's fried. I got to catch up. But they said that I guess insurance was the shippers had to deal with the potential problems. There wasn't really a mechanism in place to handle some of the insurance and cargo security for extra riders or something. Is that something we may see a larger challenge? I hate to use the C word for cartels, but I wonder if there's opportunistic non-state actors who may say, hey, I see a lot more stuff coming in my neck of the woods. Let me take a little cut. Give me a pallet out of the back of your Red Bull, something like that.
Yeah, yeah. That was always interesting going across the border into Mexico, and we always told the customer like, there's not like once you go into Mexico, there's not the controls, I'll call it, government controls and things around when you're shipping across the border. So a lot of times it is on the shipper to carry an extra rider on that. It certainly helps to use known carriers that are crossing the border. So, I've done it for a number of years. And if you use the right people that are crossing the border and they know who they're working with in Mexico, you don't run into a ton of issues. I absolutely have seen instances where, in Mexico City, we had a guy that was living down in Mexico City, and at one point he was locked up in his apartment because there was cartel activity that they basically shut down a road and took what they wanted from the people that were stuck on the road. So, it's a scary story, but I mean those things are happening, and so it's something to be protective against. But I don't know that anything will change there because I don't know the politics of Mexico and how things operate down there and the way that works. But I know from a transportation standpoint, it's always, work with somebody that you know and you trust down in Mexico that helps you get freight where it needs to go.
And I think also that's maybe why locations and designing where you want these shippers to be as close to the border as possible to minimize movement.
Yeah.
That's probably another thing. But I wonder if, especially if you're the carrier at these cross border facilities, I'm assuming that means extra security and more attention because, I had this happen one time in a Laredo terminal. We lost a trailer. It was a $5 million beauty products launch for one of these makeup people. The trailer was lost for 6 months. They charged us $5 million afterwards. But, those things happen even on a good day. I can only imagine we see more movements, maybe more complexity and risk of losing stuff, either accidental or purpose.
Yeah, it's a fair question. I don't know that there's a real black and white answer to it, but to your point, I think it just boils down to being hyper vigilant in the processes you have, the people that you're using. I think if there's more cross border activity, right, you're gonna see these carriers grow that handle that business, and I don't do as much across the border as I used to in the past. In the past, we had a large customer that at a former company where we did a ton across the border in three different border crossings and on a daily basis. And we had the right partners, right? We had the right carriers in Mexico and in the U.S. that were helping do that. Of course, Canada's a little different, and there's different rules in Canada and certainly a different government there. It's a little bit different and a little bit easier from that standpoint. But I think if you look at the southern border and if that's where we're going to grow and do a lot more nearshoring, I think it's all about just being vigilant, working with the right partners, and those partners are going to grow, right? They're going to be the same people doing that freight and helping you get it to and from Mexico in a safe manner.
Final thoughts here as well. Got about 3 minutes left. By modes, intermodal and such. I know that there had been instances in Los Angeles where some of the rail cars had been broken into. Some folks are scoping them out. But when you're looking at cargo theft, is there any, is the best practices just kind of across the board? Or if I've got something going on the rail, do I need to take any extra steps compared to truckload? Or, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't personally in our network. We haven't seen that as big of a problem. To your point, you see stuff on the news. I don't know that I've seen good statistics on where most of it's happening. I know you shared a graphic, which is good, but whether there's intermodal that's happening more frequently than over the road, I feel like intermodal is less exposed because it's generally in transit and going. And I mean, I don't. To your point, you made a good point earlier about people might follow trucks out of a facility they know ships high quality or high value goods. I don't know that people are following trains across the country trying to pick out a certain rail car that looks better than another one, right? So it's just I don't know if there's anything different I would do from a shipper standpoint. I think it's more about just being vigilant, making sure your stuff's insured, and trying to control the things you can control. Somebody breaking into a container or a trailer, they're gonna do that if they want to do that, right? It's a matter of trying to make it as difficult on them to identify the real high value stuff when you're shipping it.
I feel like given how like rail cars are over a mile long nowadays, your average cargo thief is probably like, look, I'm not going to crack all these open. I'm going to go find the guy outside the electronics facility or something. I can at least predict
Yeah,
that it's probably toilet paper or something else. But wrapping
yeah.
things up, looking forward, about a minute left. What are some of the things that you're keeping an eye on, or any recent developments? Anything we should be aware of coming across the wire in terms of theft prevention or cargo theft?
Yeah, no, I think there's some good technologies out there, and I talked to a couple technology providers a couple weeks ago at F3. I think vet those out and see how that technology can support people's business. I think it's going to be being smarter with the people that are spoofing carriers and stealing loads in very creative ways. I do think as an industry we need to make sure we're talking to each other and sharing that stuff. Right? What are the details between how people are pulling that out? Working with load boards, right? I know load boards are trying to support some more than others on hey, here's theft prevention and ways we can help. So I think as an industry, we just need to keep talking about it and find ways to share information and share best practices to prevent it.
Perfect. 20 seconds left. Best way to get in touch, find out more information about ODW or yourself.
Yeah, Phil.Schmidbauer at odwlogistics.com. I'm on LinkedIn. You can just go to the ODW Logistics website. We've got all kinds of stuff on there as well. So certainly appreciate it, Thomas. Thanks for having me today.
Thanks for your time, Phil. Looking forward to catching up again. Have a great evening or afternoon as well. Good Lord, it's getting dark early. Throw me off. But that's it for this show. Running low on time, but you can check this thing out. If you're just joining us, it will be on demand, Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Newsletter comes out Thursdays, 2 p.m., freightwaves.com/loaded and rolling. Join us next week, Tuesday, 1 p.m. We'll do it live.